Ladies and gentlemen, we meet not in a time of peace, but in a time of uncertainty. The world outside may shake with noise and news, but I ask you for a few moments to attend to something quiet, almost fragile, the life of the mind. Some may ask, why read books when the world burns? Why write poems when the cities fall? Why attend lectures when headlines are filled with fear? And these are fair questions, but let us examine what they imply. Are we to believe that thought and truth, beauty and reason are luxuries fit only for calm seasons and pleasant days? That when thunder strikes, wisdom must retreat? That when the house is on fire, we may no longer speak of what it means to be human? No, I say, precisely in times of crisis, the life of the mind becomes not less important, but more. The soldier does not cease to be a man when he wears a uniform. The teacher does not abandon truth simply because the winds of conflict blow against the classroom door, and the student, however anxious or distracted, still carries within him or her the divine hunger for understanding. We must not mistake urgency for clarity. A world in crisis will tempt us to focus only on survival. But if we reduce all effort to survival, we will one day ask, what are we surviving for? To learn, to think, to love what is good and true. These are not hobbies. They are the very soul of civilization. Some will say, but it is indulgent to pursue education now. And I say it is dangerous not to. A world that forgets to think will soon forget to care. And a world that forgets to care will soon forget to be human. Let us not be fooled into imagining that danger makes truth irrelevant. Quite the opposite. Truth becomes all the more precious when lies parade in uniform, beauty all the more vital when ugliness marches boldly, reason all the more sacred when chaos calls it weak, that we study not because the world is safe, but because the world is broken. We learn not to hide from the storm, but to prepare to rebuild after it has passed us. Oh, let books still be opened, let minds still be sharpened, let questions still be asked, even in the shadow of dread. Because if we abandon the life of the mind now, we will emerge from this hour poorer, not only in goods, but in soul. Let us be found, even in darkness, holding light. Education is more vital during crisis, not less. This statement may strike some as paradoxical. After all, in times of upheaval, when bombs fall, economies crash, or disease spreads, our instinct is to prioritize what appears immediately necessary. Safety, food, shelter, survival. Under such pressing conditions, study might seem irrelevant, even frivolous. Yet it is precisely in these moments of uncertainty and fear that the value of education reveals its truest form. Far from being a luxury of peace, education becomes an anchor in the storm, a light in the fog, and a declaration that humanity is more than its crises. To suggest that learning should be postponed until after the emergency is over is to imply that learning is an extra, an accessory to life, rather than part of its foundation. But history reminds us that great minds have done some of their deepest thinking under duress. Augustine wrote as the Roman Empire crumbled. Newton developed his theories while plague ravaged the countryside. Prisoners, refugees, and soldiers have studied philosophy, literature, and theology while the world around them burned. Why? Because education does not depend on comfort. It depends on the conviction that knowledge matters, no matter what surrounds us. Crisis tempts us to focus solely on action. Do something we're told. Move. React. But thought, contemplation, and learning are not an action. They are the soil from which right action grows. When we educate ourselves during troubled times, we are not retreating from the world. We are preparing to meet it more wisely. The person who continues to read, to think, to ask hard questions, is shaping the tools of discernment, of courage, of endurance. In such times, unthinking action may do more harm than good. A heart moved by compassion is essential, but a heart guided by wisdom is indispensable. Education during crisis is also an act of defiance. When we continue to teach and learn, we assert that truth still matters even when lies are louder. We declare that beauty still has value even when the world is scarred. We proclaim that thought has meaning even when chaos threatens reason. To teach geometry while bombs fall, to study poetry while sirens sound, is to say, I will not let fear decide who I am or what I become. It is to say, I believe in a future beyond this darkness. Furthermore, education in the midst of crisis keeps our humanity intact. When suffering dominates the scene, it is easy to let utility govern all choices. But if we focus only on survival, we risk forgetting what we are surviving for. The moment we say there is no time for art, we are saying there is no time to be fully human. But even in war, even in famine, even in plague, we remain human. And to be human is to question, to wonder, to seek. To deny ourselves education in crisis is to surrender the best part of ourselves just when we need it most. Another reason education is essential during crisis is that it offers perspective. When the present moment looms large and terrifying, the study of history reminds us that we are not the first to face hardship. Literature gives us empathy, philosophy gives us clarity, science gives us method. Each of these disciplines helps to make sense of what is happening and offers models of how others have endured. The voice of an ancient writer may seem far removed, but it may speak more wisely to the current moment than the loudest contemporary commentary. Moreover, education during hardship serves others, not just ourselves. The knowledge cultivated now will shape the actions taken tomorrow. Today's student may become tomorrow's leader, healer, innovator, or teacher. A crisis narrows our vision, but education widens it again. It keeps alive a sense of possibility, a commitment to rebuilding, a faith that ideas matter and that they can outlast even the worst of times. That prioritize education in the face of suffering is not to ignore suffering. It is to resist being conquered by it. It is to plant something that cannot be burned or bombed or taken away. Even if the books are lost, the mind shaped by education remains, ready to think clearly, speak truthfully, and act justly. That is why education is not a postponable luxury. It is a necessary good. It is not a quiet indulgence, but a loud refusal to accept despair as the final word. To educate during a crisis is also a statement of faith, not just religious faith, though for many it includes that, but faith in meaning, in recovery, in the endurance of what is true. It says there will be a future, and when it comes, let it find us prepared, not only with strong arms and willing hands, but with wise minds and trained hearts. Let it find us having done more than survive. Let it find us having grown. The mind must not surrender to fear or urgency. In moments of crisis, fear comes naturally. It is immediate, instinctive, and persuasive. Urgency joins it, demanding quick decisions and rapid action. Together, they create a rhythm that seems impossible to resist, a constant pounding that drowns out everything else. They urge us to abandon reflection for reaction, silence for noise, thought for motion. But if we yield the mind to this pressure, if we allow fear and urgency to govern our intellect, then we do not merely act hastily, we begin to think wrongly, to believe falsely, and eventually to live poorly. The danger is not simply that we stop thinking, but that we begin thinking under the rule of fear. A mind ruled by fear does not seek truth, it seeks safety. It does not ask what is right, but what will protect me most quickly. While this may seem wise in the short term, it rarely leads to sound decisions. Fear bends facts, distorts reality, and narrows the imagination. It favors the simple over the true, the loud over the reasonable, the immediate over the lasting. Fear pretends to be a guide, but it is a tyrant. Urgency, on the other hand, wears a more respectable face. It whispers that delay is dangerous, that now is the only time to act, and that waiting to think is the same as failing to act. Yet what is called urgent is often just noisy. What is truly urgent usually benefits from clear thinking, not less of it. Rush minds misjudge. They follow whatever seems strong, popular, or emotionally satisfying. Urgency is not always wrong, but it is always suspicious of reflection. And This suspicion is fatal to wisdom. A healthy mind must resist both fear and urgency, not by denying danger or ignoring the need for timely action, but by remaining faithful to its own calling. To weigh, to reason, to consider, to imagine. The mind's duty is not to feel safe or to appear quick. It is to see clearly. It must rise above the panic and say, "Let us understand this." It must dare to pause when all the world is shouting go. It must ask questions that fear would silence and make distinctions that urgency would blur. This is not weakness. It is courage of the highest order. There is a strange comfort in acting without thinking. When we are afraid, doing something, anything, seems to quiet the panic. But thoughtlessness is a poor foundation. Actions built on it are like bridges built in fog, unstable, misdirected, prone to collapse. If the mind does not hold its ground, nothing else will. The heart may be sincere, but sincerity cannot replace clarity. The will may be strong, but strength in the wrong direction is still failure. The mind is the compass in the storm. It may not calm the waves, but it helps steer the ship. In times of trouble, society often places more value on results than on ideas. But without ideas, results are blind. Action unguided by reason becomes flailing. Belief unguided by thought becomes fanaticism. Conviction unguided by knowledge becomes cruelty. History has seen this many times. When intellect surrenders to emotion, when propaganda replaces philosophy, when slogans replace arguments. These are not marks of strength. They are symptoms of a culture in retreat from truth. It is no small thing to preserve the independence of thought in a time of fear. It requires training, patience, and often solitude. It requires the willingness to be misunderstood, the courage to go slowly when others are rushing, and the discipline to test one's own assumptions. This is why the cultivation of the mind is not an academic exercise, it is a moral and spiritual act. The mind must be trained before the crisis comes, and it must be protected when the crisis arrives. Point one might ask, is there a time to act without thinking? Yes, of course. Not every moment permits deep deliberation. But the point is not that we must always think before every move. It is that we must never live in a way that excludes thinking altogether. The habits we form when life is peaceful will govern us when life is not. If we abandon careful thought now, we will not find it suddenly available later. If we treat reflection as a luxury, we will discover that in crisis we are impoverished. The temptation to stop thinking is strong because thinking is slow and crisis is fast. Thinking is uncomfortable and fear offers easy comfort. Thinking is uncertain while urgency promises certainty. But what thinking gives us, though slower, harder, and more demanding, is a vision of reality more faithful than any emotion or impulse can offer. It trains us to see things not just as they appear, but as they are. It reminds us that truth is not always convenient, but it is always worth the effort. The discipline of the mind is not opposed to feeling. It is its companion. True thought does not numb the heart, it strengthens it. It does not silence conscience, it refines it. To think in the midst of fear is not to be cold, it is to be clear. And clarity in dark days is one of the rarest and most needed virtues. When others abandon reason, those who continue to think become guardians of meaning. When others choose comfort over truth, those who hold to truth become lights on the path. Fear will always try to dominate, and urgency will always try to rule, but they do not deserve the throne of the mind. That place belongs to truth, sought through honest, patient, disciplined thought. The mind must not be driven by panic or hurried into blindness. It must stand and see and judge, even when all the world tells it not to. Intellectual life preserves truth, beauty, and reason. These three, truth, beauty, and reason, are not ornaments added to life when we have extra time. They are the pillars that uphold civilization. In times of peace, we often take them for granted, allowing their presence to fade into the background. But in times of conflict or upheaval, their absence becomes painfully clear. We begin to see that without truth, society descends into confusion. Without beauty, we lose the ability to hope. Without reason, we become prey to every impulse, every fear, every false promise. The intellectual life is the means by which these values are remembered, restored, and protected. Truth does not always shout. Often it whispers. It comes slowly, with care, demanding patience and honesty. It is not always convenient or comfortable. In fact, truth often disrupts our plans and challenges our preferences. Yet it is truth that allows us to build anything that lasts. When lies multiply, when propaganda floods the airwaves, when the loudest voices replace the wisest, it is the intellectual life that guards the flame of truth. It does this not through force or violence, but through persistent attention, through the willingness to ask, to seek, to doubt, to revise, to understand. It insists that truth is not whatever suits the moment, but something independent, something higher, something worth suffering for. Beauty, too, is preserved by the intellect, not in the sense of collecting pretty things, but in the sense of perceiving the order and harmony that lies beneath the surface of reality. Beauty reminds us that not all value is measurable, not all goodness is useful. A poem may not feed the body, but it nourishes the soul. A piece of music may not stop a war, but it can keep the human spirit alive while the war rages on. The intellectual life trains us to see beauty not merely in art, but in nature, in thought, in character. It cultivates our taste for what is noble and uplifting, allowing us to resist the pull of ugliness, vulgarity, and despair. Reason binds both truth and beauty together. It is the faculty by which we distinguish between what is real and what is imagined, between what is good and what is merely pleasing. Reason disciplines the mind, keeping it from drifting into fantasy or falling into error. It teaches us to ask, is this so, before we say, this is what I want to believe. In times of crisis, reason becomes all the more essential. The passionate slogans, the emotional appeals, the urgent demands, they can sweep through a population like wildfire. But reason slows the spread. It forces examination. It asks for evidence. It makes a space where conversation can happen instead of conflict. Without reason, truth is overwhelmed and beauty is distorted. The intellectual life, then, is not the refuge of the weak, but the armor of the wise. It is not a passive retreat from the world, but an active engagement with it. The scholar, the teacher, the thinker, the reader, these are not irrelevant figures, but guardians of the things that make life worth living. In dark times, their work may seem small or distant, but without them, we lose the ability to speak clearly, to think deeply, to live rightly. Their work sustains the conditions under which freedom, justice, and peace are even possible. That it is often said that when crisis strikes, practicality must come first. And yes, the body must be fed, the wounded cared for, the cities defended. But this must not lead us to believe that the intellectual life is a distraction. In truth, it is the foundation upon which practical action depends. What guides the medic's hands, the judge's decisions, the soldier's discipline? It is knowledge, it is values, it is reason, all products of the intellectual life. To cut ourselves off from thought is to sever the root from the fruit. The moment we say, thinking can wait, we begin to act without understanding, and the consequences of such action can be disastrous. Furthermore, intellectual life creates continuity. While buildings fall and leaders change, the pursuit of truth, beauty, and reason endures. This pursuit connects generations, cultures, and people of all conditions. It reminds us that we are part of a larger story, one that began before us and will continue after us. In crisis, it is tempting to believe that the present moment is all that matters. But the intellectual life says otherwise. It insists that memory matters, that heritage matters, that the long view is more trustworthy than the immediate thrill. In cultivating intellectual life, we also cultivate humility. We come to see how much we do not know. We encounter minds greater than our own, ideas we had never considered, questions we cannot easily answer. This humility protects us from arrogance, from the belief that our instincts are always right or our emotions always justified. It creates space for listening, for dialogue, for correction. It prevents the descent into self-righteousness or ideological fanaticism. In a world dominated by shouting, the thoughtful voice is rare, but it is also the one most worth hearing. The intellectual life is not cold or detached. It is full of love, love for truth, love for beauty, love for the human capacity to reason and reflect. It is not opposed to emotion, but it tests emotion against reality. It does not demand we silence our hearts, but it teaches our hearts to listen. It does not crush imagination, but it anchors imagination in the real. In doing so, it allows us to live more fully, not merely reacting to the world, but understanding it, shaping it, and finding meaning within it. The preservation of truth, beauty, and reason is not the task of some elite class. It is the responsibility of anyone who refuses to let ignorance, brutality, or fear define what it means to be human. We learn not to escape, but to rebuild. It is a mistake, though a common one, to think of education and intellectual effort as a form of escape from the real world. In times of crisis, when streets are filled with unrest, when headlines grow darker by the day, when the air is thick with anxiety, the pursuit of learning can seem detached, almost irresponsible. People may ask, what good is reading a book when people are hungry, or what use is studying history when the present feels so urgent? Such questions often carry a hidden accusation, as if to learn is to flee from responsibility. But true learning is never a flight from reality. It is a preparation to face it. The idea that learning is an escape implies that it is passive, that it is somehow a luxury one indulges in when nothing more important demands attention. But the act of learning is anything but passive. It is strenuous, deliberate, and engaged. It requires effort, imagination, and discipline. It stretches the mind beyond its present limits and invites it into dialogue with voices from the past, with truths that transcend the current hour. Far from being a retreat, learning is an advance, a movement toward understanding, toward wisdom, toward the tools that will help rebuild what is broken. Rebuilding, whether of a house, a nation, or a human soul, demands more than good intentions. It demands knowledge. It demands vision. It demands people who can look beyond the debris and imagine something new. That imagination is not the product of daydreams. It is the fruit of long reflection, of careful study, of an intellect trained to recognize patterns, to learn from past mistakes, to draw on the accumulated wisdom of those who came before. When we study philosophy, literature, science, or history, we are not turning away from the ruins. We are collecting the stones and timber for what must come next. Those who dismiss learning as impractical often confuse activity with effectiveness. They assume that to rebuild means to act quickly, visibly, and physically. But the strongest structures are not built in haste. They are drawn first in the architect's mind, refined in planning, grounded in knowledge of materials and purpose. So, too, with human communities, laws must be just, and justice must be informed by history. Policies must be wise, and wisdom must be formed by philosophy. Recovery must be compassionate, and compassion must be shaped by moral understanding. None of this happens without learning. When the present feels chaotic, learning offers more than facts. It offers perspective. It allows us to step back from the noise and see patterns, roots, and consequences. It connects us to broader stories, to human struggles that came long before us, to questions that others have asked and answered across time and cultures. This connection does not remove us from our duties, it strengthens them. It reminds us that what we are facing is not entirely new, and that others have walked through fire and come out bearing light. We are not the first to rebuild, and we will not be the last. Furthermore, learning equips us with language, words that heal, that clarify, that resist lies. A society that abandons learning loses its vocabulary of hope. It forgets how to describe the good, the true, the beautiful. It forgets how to mourn rightly, how to celebrate nobly, how to reason carefully. In such a world, people shout, but do not speak, demand, but do not persuade. Learning teaches us to shape our words not into weapons of rage, but into instruments of understanding. And without understanding, rebuilding is impossible. Even in silence, learning forms the soul. It teaches patience, humility, and perseverance. It asks us to sit quietly with complexity, to wait for insight, to admit ignorance. These are virtues we desperately need when the world is broken. The one who has practiced waiting in study will be better prepared to wait in suffering. The one who has wrestled with hard questions in books will be better able to wrestle with hard realities in life. Learning is not a wall to hide behind. It is a foundation to build upon. There is also healing in learning, not the shallow kind that distracts, but the deep kind that restores. To read a poem in a time of pain is to remember that beauty still exists. To study history in the shadow of injustice is to remember that justice has been pursued before and can be pursued again. To reflect on philosophy when the world seems senseless is to reclaim reason from the grip of despair. Learning does not erase wounds, but it keeps them from defining the whole story. It reminds us that the human spirit has not only survived tragedy, but has answered it with creativity, wisdom, and resilience. When a child learns to read in a refugee camp, or a prisoner studies law behind bars, or a community builds a school in the ashes of war, they are not escaping reality. They are challenging it. They are refusing to let suffering have the last word. They are preparing to build something better, even if the materials are not yet in their hands. Learning becomes, in these moments, an act of defiance, of hope, of vision. This is why education cannot be postponed until the crisis is over. It is part of the crisis response. It is part of the repair. Those who are learning now will be the ones who teach, who lead, who write, who heal, who invent, who remember, who imagine. And what they build will be shaped by the minds they have formed, the truths they have encountered, the wisdom they have received. To rebuild a world, one must first rebuild the human mind. That is what learning begins to do. Abandoning thought is the first step toward losing humanity. Thought is not an optional feature of human life. It is at the core of what makes us human. To think is to reflect, to evaluate, to weigh what is before us and ask what is right, what is true, what is worth doing. When we abandon this capacity, even temporarily, we begin to drift from our nature. We surrender the very thing that lifts us above instinct, above impulse, above mere survival. In times of crisis, the temptation to abandon thought is stronger than ever. The pressure to act quickly, to react emotionally, to choose sides without reflection grows more intense. But it is precisely at such moments that thought must be defended with vigilance, for in neglecting it we endanger not only our choices, but our identity. There are many reasons why people stop thinking. Fear is one of them. When we are afraid, we crave certainty. We want answers, immediate and simple, answers that reassure rather than challenge. But thought is rarely simple and almost never immediate. It asks us to slow down, to consider, to endure ambiguity. This patience is difficult to maintain in a climate of fear. Yet the refusal to think does not remove fear. It only deepens it, because decisions made without thought are fragile, easily manipulated, and often wrong. Fear may drive us to action, but only thought can guide that action toward justice, toward peace, toward truth. Another reason thought is abandoned is fatigue. When the mind is exhausted, when the news is overwhelming, when the problems seem too large, it is easier to retreat into slogans, into prepackaged opinions, into whatever demands the least effort. This mental weariness is understandable, but it is dangerous. For when we cease to think for ourselves, someone else will do our thinking for us. And those who take up that task may not have our good mind. The person who stops thinking does not become free. They become dependent. They become a tool in someone else's hand, their emotions easily stirred, their decisions easily shaped by manipulation and propaganda. The abandonment of thought also comes from pride. To think requires humility. It requires admitting we do not know everything, that our first instincts may be wrong, that others may have insights we lack. But pride resists such admissions. It prefers certainty to curiosity, control to learning. It clings to opinions not because they are true, but because they are ours. In such a state, thought becomes a threat to the ego, and so it is dismissed, silenced, ridiculed. Yet this pride is hollow. It is the armor of a mind that fears being challenged, a mind more interested in being right than in being honest, that a society that forgets how to think will not forget for long how to suffer. Poor thinking leads to poor choices, and poor choices lead to real consequences, economic, political, moral. When thought is absent, prejudice fills the void. When reason is abandoned, anger takes the lead. When careful judgment is mocked, extremes flourish. In such a world, complexity is treated as weakness, and shouting is mistaken for strength. Division becomes inevitable because no one is listening, no one is reasoning, no one is asking whether the conclusions we draw are based on evidence or simply emotion. Education, in its truest sense, is not about filling minds with information. It is about forming the habit of thought, of patient inquiry, of reasoned argument, of respectful dialogue. It trains us not merely to accumulate facts, but to examine them, to see connections, to challenge assumptions. It teaches us how to spot fallacies, how to resist manipulation, how to pursue truth even when it is unpopular or uncomfortable. This kind of education is not a luxury. It is a defense against the erosion of our shared humanity. It reminds us that disagreement need not mean hatred, that correction need not mean humiliation, that to change one's mind is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. Thought, at its best, cultivates empathy. It asks us to imagine lives different from our own, to consider how others feel, to understand what drives them. In doing so, it fights against cruelty. It breaks down the barriers of indifference and helps us see the human being behind the argument, the story behind the statistic. This is not something emotion alone can achieve. Emotion may move us to care, but thought directs that care wisely. It helps us ask not just how to feel, but what to do. And how to do it well. Stop thinking is not only to risk making bad decisions, it is to risk forgetting what it means to be a person, a creature that reacts to stimuli, that follows crowds, that obeys impulses, is not living as a human being. The human mind was made to explore, to question, to reflect. This is not mere mental activity, it is moral activity. It is how we recognize the dignity of others, how we search for what is right, how we contribute meaningfully to the world around us. Without thought, even the noblest intentions can be twisted, the highest ideals misused. History is full of examples where people acted with great passion and terrible ignorance, causing harm while believing they were doing good in the face of confusion, noise, and conflict. Choosing to think may feel like a small act, but it is a powerful one. It is the refusal to be reduced to a follower of trends or a captive of fears. It is the decision to remain fully awake, fully responsible, fully human. In moments when the world seems to spin too fast, when every opinion is shouted, when every issue is weaponized, the quiet discipline of thought becomes an act of courage. It does not promise easy answers, but it opens the path to real understanding. And in that understanding lies the possibility of wisdom, of healing, of renewal. Thought is not the enemy of action. It is its most faithful companion. Without it, action is blind and passion is dangerous. With it, even small choices can be rooted in truth and directed toward good.